They said I flatlined for 11 seconds. I don't remember the silence. I remember the fall. I was slicing an apple for lunch, my hands steady like always, when something inside my head cracked like glass. It wasn't pain at first, just a wrongness, a sudden tilt in the world. The knife slipped from my fingers, bounced off the counter. I gripped the edge of the sink, but my legs gave way. The floor rushed up to meet me, and then there was nothing. Just white. Cold. Then machines. When I came to, I was in a room full of noise and light, tubes in my arms, a needle in my wrist, a machine clicking with my breath. I tried to speak, but the sound came out wrong. I couldn't move my right hand. My tongue felt like cotton. A nurse leaned over me with a warm smile and said, "You're safe, Mrs. Vale. You're in the ICU. You've had a stroke. But you're here. You made it." She handed me a piece of paper folded neatly in thirds. My name was typed at the top in bold letters like I was a stranger. It was from my daughter. No phone call, no face, just a note. "Mom, you're safe. We're in Maui back soon. Love, Diane." That was all it said. My name is Eleanor Vale. I'm 73 years old, and 9 days ago I died for 11 seconds. I came back to life in a hospital bed with no one by my side and a handwritten note in place of a family. And over the next 9 days I would come to realize something far worse than death had already happened. They were planning to erase me, quietly, while they watched the waves roll in. And I let them think they could. The days in the ICU didn't feel like days at all. There was no sunrise, no window, no sound of life beyond the slow, rhythmic beep of machines and the hushed shuffle of nurses' shoes. The ceiling tiles above me never changed. Same small specks, same yellowish glow from the overhead lights. They dimmed the lights at night, but it was never dark. Just quieter. I couldn't speak at first. My mouth worked, but the sounds were fractured, slurred. I was aware of my own body in the way you notice a bruise. Tender. Disobedient. My right hand was still. Stiff. When I tried to move my fingers, they only twitched. A nurse checked my vitals every few hours, smiling as if nothing was wrong. Her name was Carla. She brought warm washcloths and fluffed the pillow, spoke to me softly as she worked. But she never asked if I had family coming. She already knew the answer. No one called. No one walked through the door. Not on the first day. Not the second. Not the third. The note from Diane stayed folded on the tray beside my bed. I asked Carla to read it once more, just to be sure I hadn't misunderstood. She held it up gently, read the exact words again, then asked if I wanted her to call them for me. I tried to nod, but my neck betrayed me, barely moving. She said she would try. I never heard her follow through. Lying there, I had too much time to think. My mind was still working, quietly, steadily. I remembered Diane's voice on the phone last month, lightly suggesting I take a look at some lovely little residences she'd read about. "They have weekly game nights and staff on call," she'd said. "You'd never be alone." I told her I liked being alone. She didn't hear me. I thought about Ryan, too, her husband. Always polite, but too polished, always watching the bottom line. He'd managed my taxes last spring, told me it was time to consolidate, simplify. "Let Diane help you with the paperwork," he'd said. "Less stress for everyone." At the time, it had sounded helpful. Now it sounded like preparation. The strangest part of those first few days wasn't the loneliness. It was how easily the world went on without me, how completely still my room was while time marched forward outside. I imagined them on the beach, laughing, passing sunscreen and plastic cups. I could almost see Diane tilting her head toward the sun, phone buried in the sand, unread messages blinking away. By day 4, the silence became something else. It settled into my skin. I stopped waiting for the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I stopped watching the door. I stared at the ceiling and counted the seconds between each beep of the monitor, and somewhere in the rhythm of that machine, I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't call them either. On the third night, a nurse named Lena came in near midnight to adjust the IV. She was younger, softer spoken than Carla, and knew enough to be clumsy with the chart clipped to the end of my bed. After she left, I noticed she had forgotten to close the folder. It sat slightly ajar, just within reach of my left hand. I stared at it for a long time, knowing what it was, knowing it probably held nothing but medication dosages and intake forms. But something told me to try. With more effort than I care to admit, I reached out and pulled it toward me. My fingers fumbled, clumsy with the bandage around my wrist. I used my elbow to flip the cover open and saw the familiar lines of my name, my birth date, and a string of recent notes. The words were clean, clinical, emotionless. They spoke of deficits, impaired speech, limited mobility, potential non-recovery. I read slowly, piecing it all together between long blinks of exhaustion. Halfway down the page, I saw Diane's name. It was listed beside the words, Activated POA. My breath caught, sharp and small in my throat. The date was the morning after I was admitted. A durable power of attorney, the document I signed years ago when my husband died. Back then, Diane said it was just a precaution. "It's what people do, Mom," she told me. "So I can handle things if you're ever not able to. You'd do the same for me." I'd nodded, trusting her, trusting what she meant to me. Now I saw what it meant to her. A second note, entered that same day, confirmed she had met with the case manager and given instructions for future placement. Patient likely to transition to long-term care. Those were the words. Not possibly, not maybe, likely. It wasn't just paperwork, it was a plan. I closed the folder and let it slide back into place, just as Lena returned. She didn't notice. She smiled and asked if I wanted the blanket adjusted. I nodded faintly, careful to show nothing more. She tucked the sheet under my chin, called me brave, and walked out. Alone again, I let my eyes close, not from sleep, but from clarity. They thought I couldn't read, couldn't think, couldn't understand what was being decided for me, while I lay quiet and half-paralyzed in a bed no one intended for me to leave. They didn't know I remembered every detail. The notary who came to my kitchen, the little gold pen Diane used when she signed, the way Ryan had waited near the door, arms crossed like someone who had already won. Now they had the papers, the power, and a house full of things I loved. I could almost hear the drawers opening. But they'd made one mistake. They had assumed I would never wake up. By the fifth day, I had stopped pretending I was confused. I let the nurses think I was drifting. I let my eyes wander past them when they spoke. I nodded slowly, always slowly, as though the words took time to settle in, but inside I was gathering, remembering, listening. The television mounted on the wall stayed tuned to daytime news or soft cooking shows. No one bothered to change the channel. One morning they showed a segment on Hawaii. The camera panned over beaches lined with palm trees, waves rolling up to the shore, tourists laughing with drinks in their hands. The air in the room felt tighter somehow. I could almost hear Diane's voice again, bright and relaxed, saying, "It's just a little getaway. Ryan booked it ages ago. We all need the break." The break she needed was from me. I pictured them arriving at the resort. Maybe the same one Diane had shown me on her phone last Christmas, sliding it across the table with photos of a lanai overlooking the ocean. "Someday I'll take you," she said. But I never asked her to. I'd never liked flying, never liked crowds or heat. That was her world, not mine. And now it seemed that was exactly where they had gone, phones turned off, sipping something sweet while the paperwork moved along without me. They were probably eating fresh fruit and local fish while a real estate agent toured my house. I imagined the woman walking through my kitchen, pointing out the original hardwood, the vintage oven that I'd cared for like a child. She'd say something about the bones of the house being strong, the neighborhood being ideal for young families. And Diane, miles away, would nod over the phone and tell her to proceed. I had left that kitchen in the middle of making lunch. The apple had rolled off the counter. A sandwich half assembled. I could still see the bread, mustard smeared just right, a thin slice of tomato balanced at the edge of the plate. That was the moment they seized. While my hand was numb and my mind was fogged, they set the machine in motion. Not a machine of medicine, but of removal, quiet, efficient, and practiced. That was what stung the most. The efficiency. As if they had rehearsed this. As if there had been meetings I was not part of, conversations held while I was still speaking in full sentences, while I was still walking from room to room, turning off the lights at night. They hadn't paused. Not even for a day. Diane hadn't called to ask what I wanted. She had acted. She had stepped into the role of executor, not daughter, of organizer, not caretaker. It was as if I had already gone, as if the only thing left to do was clean up the details and pick up the check. But I was still here, still breathing, still listening. And now I was watching too. It happened on the morning of the 6th day. My voice returned not with ceremony, not with any grand realization, but as a whisper scraped from the bottom of my throat. I was trying to ask for water. My lips formed the shape before I realized a sound had actually come out. The nurse, Carla, again leaned closer and smiled. "You're getting stronger," she said gently, adjusting the pillow behind my back. I nodded, careful not to show how much I already knew. I let her believe I was grateful, let her take the small victory for what it was, but inside, it was something else entirely. The return of my voice wasn't just about sound. It meant access. It meant I could call. I could ask questions. I could reclaim what had been taken from me in silence. But I said nothing of that. Not yet. I didn't want anyone to know what I could do. Not Diane, not Ryan, not even the staff meant to care for me. Because now I understood the value of being underestimated. Later that day, I asked Carla if she could leave a notepad by my bedside. She was thrilled, said it was a wonderful sign, part of my recovery. I thanked her, soft and slow, then waited until the room emptied. I tested the pen between my fingers, steadying it against the trembling in my hand. My grip was weak, but it held. I wrote down my daughter's phone number from memory, then my bank's. Then I wrote my own name, over and over again, until the letters looked like they belonged to me again. That night, I began mouthing words in the dark, names, addresses, account numbers, the code to the lockbox hidden behind the painting in my bedroom. I remembered everything. My mind had never slipped. Only my body had gone slack, but now even that was returning to me. The physical therapist came in on the 7th morning. He was young, polite, and full of hopeful praise. He didn't know I had been moving my legs under the blanket for 3 days, that I had already practiced shifting my weight, one muscle group at a time, until I could sit up without trembling. I let him guide me through the motions, each movement rehearsed. I smiled when he said I was a fast healer. I told him I'd always been stubborn. He laughed and made a note in his tablet. I watched the screen as he typed the word progress. That word stayed with me all afternoon. Not because of what it meant to them, but because of what it meant to me. They thought progress meant healing, recovery, returning to some version of myself that they could then move, place, manage. But my progress wasn't about walking again. It was about seeing clearly, about rising step by step into the woman I had been before they decided I was gone. On the 9th day, I was discharged quietly. No balloons, no welcome home, just a form signed by a doctor I barely knew and a polite escort from a hospital volunteer who wheeled me to the curb like I was a package ready for pickup. I asked if anyone was meeting me. She checked her list, smiled, and said, "No one listed, Mrs. Vale, but we can call a cab if you'd like." I nodded. My voice was stronger now, but I didn't feel like using it. The cab driver asked for my address. I gave it to him slowly, making sure I didn't tremble. The ride home was a blur of gray streets and unwatered lawns, everything too bright and too sharp. I stared out the window as we turned onto my street. The trees looked the same, but something in my chest knew better. When we pulled up to my house, I reached for my keys. The driver waited patiently while I climbed the steps, my fingers clumsy with the unfamiliar weight of the metal. I tried the lock. It didn't turn. I paused, turned the key again. Still nothing. I stared at the door, same color, same brass numbers, same little crack in the trim that had been there for years. But the lock was new. I rang the doorbell, expecting nothing but still hoping out of habit. No answer. The windows were dark. I turned and sat down slowly on the front step, the cab pulling away behind me. My legs felt heavier than they had in days. I folded my hands and waited. 15 minutes later, my neighbor June came out to collect her mail. She saw me sitting there and rushed over, concern blooming across her face. "Eleanor, oh my goodness, are you all right? We thought, well, Diane said you were in some kind of care facility now." I blinked at her. She hesitated, then reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This came to our house by mistake," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure if I should bring it over." It was addressed to Diane, but my name was listed as the owner. I opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was a copy of a contract, the kind I'd seen years ago when we refinanced. It was a sale agreement for my home, closing scheduled in 6 days. I flipped through the pages, numb. There was a signature at the bottom. Diane's. Neat. Clean. The name I had given her, used like a signature on my absence. I thanked June softly and stood up. My legs hurt. My hands hurt. But I walked down the street anyway, heading toward the bus stop. I didn't know where I was going yet. But I knew I wasn't staying. They had taken the house while I was still breathing. They forgot to wait for me to die. I checked into a modest hotel near the bus depot under the name Helen Marsh, an old alias I had once used for a quilting newsletter I subscribed to without giving out my real details. The clerk didn't ask questions. I handed over my ID and paid in cash. The room was clean but sparse, with one window facing a brick wall and a faint smell of bleach clinging to the sheets. It was perfect. I sat on the bed and opened the envelope June had given me. The house sale papers were still neatly folded. I reread every line, this time not as a mother or a victim, but as someone who had once balanced ledgers for a living. Before I was a wife, before I was a mother, I had been precise. I knew what numbers meant, what power they held when no one thought you were paying attention. They had forgotten who I used to be. I pulled out my old notebook from my hospital bag. It was the one thing Carla had insisted I take with me. Inside were the pages I had started in the ICU, all my scribbled notes, numbers, phone lines, passwords. I added a few more, the name of the escrow officer listed on the house contract and the address of the title company. The next morning I used the hotel phone to call the bank. My voice was calm, clipped, efficient. I verified my identity, confirmed recent transfers, and requested a withdrawal of the joint savings account I had once opened with Diane as an emergency fallback. It had grown steadily from my pension over the last decade. I moved every cent into a new private account under my name only. No alerts sent, no permissions needed. The power of attorney Diane had activated worked both ways. Then I called the escrow officer, posing as myself, but with a different tone, more frail. I asked about the closing timeline, mentioned I wanted to ensure everything was completed properly. She assured me all was moving smoothly and that my daughter had handled everything on my behalf. I asked if I could stop by the office. "Of course," she said. "We always love when the seller gets involved directly. It just makes things easier." The meeting lasted 20 minutes. I signed new forms, added new stipulations. I rescinded Diane's authority over the sale. The house was still mine, and until that check cleared, I held all the strings. I contacted a realtor I had known years ago, someone who had stayed kind even after retirement. He agreed to list it under my terms. We priced it to move quickly. I offered a modest discount for an all-cash buyer who could close within days. There was no mention of Diane, no room for her to interfere. The legal framework was mine now. By nightfall, I had done what they never expected. I had reclaimed what they assumed was already theirs, not with drama, not with confrontation, but with quiet precision, the kind that doesn't need to be announced, just executed. The sale closed 2 days later. A young couple signed the final documents with excited smiles, unaware of the drama their new home had been steeped in. I watched from across the street as the moving truck pulled into the driveway. The wife stood on the front porch taking pictures, already imagining what colors she might paint the walls. I felt nothing toward them. They had bought a house, not a betrayal. They were simply part of the chain. I left no forwarding address. The funds landed in my private account by noon. I spent the next few hours at different branches of the same bank, dividing the amount into cashier's checks and safety deposit boxes under variations of my name. One under Helen Marsh, another under my maiden name, a third under initials only. I made sure that no single trail could be followed without several questions and a fair amount of persistence. The next call I made was to a lawyer in Montana. A woman named Clara, whose name I had written down years ago after seeing her on a local broadcast. She specialized in estate law and elder protections. I told her I needed to establish a living trust and remove all former family designations. She asked if there had been recent changes to my health. I told her, in a measured tone, that I had survived something worse than illness. I had survived inheritance while still alive. She didn't ask for more. She simply said, "I understand. We'll proceed." By then, I had already booked a one-way train ticket north. I took back roads and quiet routes, switching transit cards and names when necessary. I carried my documents in a plain black folder and kept the checks close, tucked beneath layers of clothing. I moved through stations like a woman no one noticed. No more hospital gown, no IVs, no chart hanging at my feet. Just slow steps and a steady grip. In Montana, Clara met me at her office with a notary and 2 assistants. I signed the documents in her quiet conference room. No one spoke unless necessary. She placed the newly created trust in a sealed envelope and handed me the keys to a mailbox and a temporary residence she had arranged with a nearby client who rented cabins to quiet tenants. Everything was legal. Everything was mine. I turned off the last cell phone that evening, disconnected the number that Diane had memorized since childhood. The email address I used for family updates was deleted. I burned my old address book in the fire pit behind the cabin, page by page, watching the ink curl and vanish into smoke. I left only one number saved in a small paper slip inside my wallet. It belonged to my sister, Miriam. We hadn't spoken in nearly 8 years, not since a falling out over something neither of us remembered clearly. But I trusted her. She was the only one who had never asked me for anything, only offered coffee and silence. And that was all I wanted now, quiet, complete distance. Let them come back to a ghost. They landed on a Sunday. The timestamp on Diane's message said 6:14 p.m. It was short and cheerful, as if nothing had shifted during their absence. "Just got home. Where are you? Did the facility forget to update us? Call me when you can." There were 3 missed calls after that, then 5. The tone began to change by morning. They had expected to walk into a house exactly as they left it. Suitcases rolled up the driveway. The garage remote didn't work. The front key no longer matched the lock. From the neighbor's view, it must have looked like a simple case of confusion, maybe a harmless error. But inside that confusion was panic. Their certainty had been stripped away. Diane called the agent. The agent referred her to escrow. Escrow referred her to me, but there was no number left, no forwarding information. Only a file showing that the property had been legally sold, funds distributed, rights transferred. They were not listed as owners, not even as secondary contacts. I had erased them from the process with surgical care. Later that evening, the couple who now owned the house returned with their realtor to address the disturbance. Diane and Ryan had been sitting on the porch, waiting, as if their presence could will the door open. I imagined the awkwardness in those first words, the pause when the truth was made plain, that they had no standing here, that they were guests, uninvited, on someone else's property. There were no legal fireworks, no police. Everything had been done within the boundaries of law, with the same power of attorney. Diane had activated herself. The irony of it tasted sharp on my tongue when I thought about it later. They had set the stage, drawn the lines, handed me the tools. I simply used them. That night, as the sun dropped behind the mountains and the wind stirred the branches near my cabin, I read through the letter I had left behind. It was not long. It had no apology, no anger, only the truth. You should have waited 9 days. Mom. Except I didn't use the dash. I had written it out, carefully, fully. A complete sentence, the way I used to teach Diane to write as a child. I imagined she read it again and again, searching for more meaning, wondering where I was, asking herself how I had moved beneath her radar. She had underestimated me, not in my weakness, but in her assumption that I would remain who she decided I was. By Monday morning, the house was no longer theirs in any sense. The utilities had changed hands. The furniture they had sent ahead remained boxed in the garage, untouched. The pictures of me they once hung on the hallway wall were nowhere to be found. I had taken nothing with me but memory. And that, it turned out, was more than enough. Montana was quiet in a way I had forgotten life could be. The air smelled clean, untouched by car exhaust or garden chemicals. The mornings arrived slowly, with long shadows and soft light through pine trees. I moved through the cabin like a guest in someone else's life, careful not to disturb the peace that had settled around me. There were no voices echoing down hallways, no reminders to take pills, no calendars marked with doctor appointments. I kept a legal pad by the window and started writing letters I knew I would never send. One to Diane, another to Ryan, and even one to my grandson, who had once called me Nana with such affection it almost brought me to tears. But I didn't write to guilt them. I wrote to remember what I had given, what I had meant, and what I had slowly stopped being in their eyes. In Diane's letter, I listed the names of every nurse who had spoken to me with dignity, even when they thought I couldn't hear. I described the exact moment I read the power of attorney form with her signature on it. I noted how quietly she had moved to take control, not with malice, but with convenience. She had not intended cruelty. That was the part I understood. It had simply been easier for her to erase me on paper than to ask me how I wanted to live. I wrote about the kitchen drawer she always complained was too cluttered, how she used to roll her eyes at the rubber bands and old coupons I kept. I told her that drawer had once held love notes from her father, recipes in my mother's handwriting, and spare keys to neighbors' houses during harder times. She never asked why I kept those things. She only saw the mess. In Ryan's letter, I didn't write much. Just a few lines about the quiet way he always scanned the room when he visited, as if tallying up what could be sold, donated, discarded. I told him I saw the way he looked at my ring, my jewelry box, the way he once asked offhand if I still had the deed to the lake cabin we sold years ago. He had never asked how I was sleeping, or if the roof still leaked. Just where the papers were kept. The letter to my grandson was different. It was softer, filled with memories of small things. A hot cocoa mustache when he was 6. The way he used to draw dinosaurs with teeth too large for their heads. I told him I forgave him for forgetting me. He was young, and his world had always revolved around whoever spoke the loudest. I hoped someday he would remember that I never raised my voice. I simply waited for space to speak. None of these letters would be sent. They were for me, for the woman they forgot existed. And in writing them, I became real again, not to them, but to myself. The days settled into a rhythm that asked very little of me. I rose early, made coffee in a small ceramic pot that reminded me of the one I used after my husband passed. There was no sound except the hum of the heater and the occasional rustle of deer along the tree line. I kept my movements slow, intentional. There was no schedule, no one to wait on or account for. For the first time in years, the quiet wasn't something I had to explain. I walked each morning. At first, just to the end of the gravel path, then farther into the woods. The air was thin and sharp, the kind that clears your mind without asking permission. I spoke to no one. My phone stayed powered off in a drawer next to a folded scarf and a tin of mints. That drawer held everything I had chosen to keep, just enough to remember, not enough to carry weight. In town, people knew me only as Helen. I paid in cash, smiled politely, and never lingered in conversation. There was safety in being no one, no expectations, no history, just a woman renting a cabin, watching the seasons begin to shift. No one asked where I had come from. No one offered guesses. And for once, I did not feel invisible. I felt hidden, on purpose. Sometimes, in the long stretches of afternoon, I found myself wondering what they were doing. Diane must have called the banks by now. She would have discovered the accounts were closed, the paperwork nullified. The trust had been rewritten without her name. The house had been sold without her hand. She would find nothing left to untangle. I wondered if Ryan had tried to hire someone to track me. He was the type to believe anything could be found with the right kind of money, but what he never understood was that money only reveals what someone wants seen, and I wanted nothing seen. Nothing followed. I had become a blank space on the map, and there was comfort in that. Occasionally I would pick up the pen again, not to write letters, but to draft a will. Clara helped me fill in the legal blanks. I named no family. The bulk of what I had went to a community shelter and an education fund for young women studying accounting. A small gesture maybe, but it felt like a closing circle, a return to who I had once been before they repurposed me into a role I never asked for. I sat at the table one evening and lit a single candle. Not for memory, not for mourning, just light for the sake of light. I realized then that I had not cried once since leaving the hospital. The grief had passed through me like weather. I hadn't fought it. I had walked into it and then beyond it. That was my freedom. Not escape, not revenge. Just a new kind of silence, one I had chosen, one they could never touch. I bought a new notebook in town, plain cover, no lines, just soft, heavy paper. I brought it home, made a pot of tea, and opened to the first page. The air was cool that afternoon, windows cracked just enough to let the wind speak. I sat at the kitchen table with a blanket across my lap and began to write, not as Eleanor Vale, not as Helen Marsh, but simply as a woman reclaiming her own name. At the top of the page, I wrote the title in slow, careful strokes. The Time I Died and Woke Up Invisible. It wasn't meant to be poetic. It was just the truth. I started with the kitchen, the moment the knife slipped, the apple falling. I described the exact way the floor felt as I hit it, the strange silence that wrapped around me like a second skin. I wrote about the hospital ceiling, the note from Diane, the cold realization that I had been left behind like an outdated piece of furniture. Each page told the story they never thought I would live to tell. Not out of vengeance, not to publish or share, This wasn't for courtrooms or therapists or dramatic confrontations. It was just a record, my record, of how they moved forward without me, of how I returned anyway. I included names. I listed dates. I captured the silence in that room where no family ever arrived. I wrote about my fingers finding the bank codes, about the strength that came back not in a rush, but in a crawl. Every detail mattered, because someday, when the story of my life is reduced to documents and dates, I want this version to be found too. The one with the grit. The one with the spine they never saw coming. I didn't write about what I lost. I wrote about what I kept, my breath, my memory, my precision. The part of me that stayed alert even when my body would not obey. I wrote until the sun dipped behind the trees and the shadows stretched long across the floor. Then I closed the book and placed it in the drawer beneath the stove. Not hidden, just waiting. That night, I stepped outside. The stars were sharp and clear. A fox darted across the path and disappeared into the brush. I felt no need to chase anything anymore, no hunger for apology. Just a deep, rooted satisfaction in having survived not just the stroke, but the extraction. The slow administrative removal from my own life. They will speak of me one day, perhaps in confusion, perhaps with guilt. Maybe Diane will sit across from someone and try to explain what happened, but she will never have the right version, because the real story, the one that mattered, was never theirs to tell. They wrote me off, but I wrote myself back in.